Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is Cheryl. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create these cards that are using a die cut to create a letterpress impression on the front of the card. And then after the first one, I'll step it up and show you how to do this one with the embossed image. So the very first thing I'm doing is taking this butterfly die, which is huge, but absolutely gorgeous. And I'm cutting two of them out of cardstock, and then I'm going to cut a third one out of vellum. So the cardstock that I'm using is Neenah Plastic Crest. I will have a link to it as well as all the other supplies in the description box below. I like this one because it's a nice thick cardstock. It's got some substance to it. If you chose to use a different type of cardstock, it'll work just as well, but you may need to put 3 layers of cardstock. This particular one is nice and thick, so it's only needing 2 to create this effect. So I'm going to take my die cuts and I'm going to glue my 2 cardstock pieces together first. And once that glue is dry, I will glue on the vellum piece. Now I like to put an acrylic block over them while they are drying just to keep everything flat. Sometimes liquid glue can warp cardstock a little bit, and this pressure of that acrylic block keeps it nice and flat and keeps everything drying perfectly. Once it is completely dry, I'm going to take my ink pads and I'm going to ink the vellum side of this die cut stack. Now, I don't need to ink the entire butterfly because it's not going to fit on the front of a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. So the part of the wing on the left-hand side that you see, I'm not going to ink the outer edge so that I have something to hold on to without getting ink all over my fingers. I'm using 3 different shades of dye ink. I haven't tried any other different types of ink to see if they would work, but I knew the dye ink would work well because dye ink doesn't dry on top of vellum. So that ink is going to sit nicely on the surface and be able to transfer over to my cardstock front. So I've got my cardstock front there that I've put on an embossing pad in my machine. I'm using my stacking for embossing in my Big Shot. I had one of the edges of the wings outside of my cutting plate, so you saw me shift it a little bit there. You need to be really, really careful if you're going to shift it because there's ink on the surface of that butterfly. If you happen to shift it, you're going to get a little bit of an ink smudge. So that impression there, or that once I've run it through my machine, it impresses the thickness of this die cut stack in the cardstock, as well as transferring the ink over to that card base front. So I'm going to show you now how to do the stepped up version. So I'm inking my butterfly the same. I use a brayer to just kind of blend the ink between the different colors, just to get a little bit more of a softer transition between them. This process is exactly the same as the first one, and the next step is where we're going to step up a little bit. So I'm once again putting it through my machine. It's pressing that thickness of that die cut stack into the cardstock there, as well as impressing or transferring the ink over to the card base front. Now I'm taking some embossing glaze and I'm putting it over the different colors of my die cut image. And I've got this sped up because it actually didn't work. I think the ink soaked into my cardstock or the card front a little bit too fast, so it didn't have anything for the embossing glaze to stick to. But I'm showing this to you just so that you know how to rectify that if you wanted to try something similar and what the fix would be. So I've got my embossing glaze on there. I kind of tap the back so that it dances around a little bit, just to kind of blend the different colors of embossing glaze between the 2 different colors. I take my excess embossing glaze and I just have a pot that I put my embossing glaze mixes, because once they're mixed, you can't separate them. I'm just taking a dry paper towel here and just lifting up any remaining ink that might be there. This is how I am fixing this front. I'm using an embossing pad and I'm putting some ink over the back of this die cut. And I'm going to put it through the machine again, making sure to line up the image exactly to how the first one was done, so that my embossing is going to be exactly on that image. And easiest way to do that was to take the bottom edge of the butterfly, press it down where it needs to be, and then slowly put them down properly. Now my die cut actually ended up shifting when I lifted up the plate after it had gone through. It ends up not messing anything up, but if you happen to have any embossing powder that sticks to the wrong spot, you can just use a soft brush to remove it before you emboss it. I ended up using just clear embossing powder for this just because you could see the color of the ink perfectly. So it doesn't really matter whether the embossing powder is clear or it's the embossing glaze. If you wanted to still use the embossing glaze, it would absolutely work. It would just intensify the color of the butterfly. Once I've got the embossing powder on there, I'm using my embossing tool and I am melting that powder throughout the whole image. Now here's where I'm adding a little bit of extra texture to the background. I'm taking my card front and I'm putting it into a stamping platform. And then I'm going to stamp a background stamp over the back. I'm using a gray stamp pad for the background. I want some texture there, but I don't want any more color to compete with the main image on the card front. So I am putting that ink over the whole background and then I'm going to stamp it. You'll see that the image isn't big enough, or the stamp isn't big enough to cover the entire background of the card. So you'll see me flip it around both the card base as well as the stamp in order to get that other side of the card base. Now I do flip the stamp over as well because I want to make sure that my writing from the stamp is the same orientation as the first image. If I had it backwards, you'd probably kind of be able to see it. Now because we embossed that butterfly image, this stamped background is actually not transferring to that. It's only stamping on the white background. The embossing is resisting it. So that way we've got some background texture, but it's not right over top of the whole butterfly. So our images are complete. I'm just cutting them down. My original paper size was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, but I want to have a little bit of a mat around it when I put it on the card base. And it's easiest to do that after the card piece is finished. That way I can choose which part I want to cut off. I'm going to glue this to some coordinating card bases and then put an acrylic block on there just to hold it down while it's drying. Now I've used this butterfly die for this technique, but it would work with pretty much any die cut you could possibly want to use. You just need to make sure to stack up those cardstock pieces and have a vellum piece over top of it. Off camera, I have got 2 sentiments here that I did in coordinating scrap papers to go to the front of my card. I'm going to make one of them a thank you card and then one of them a birthday card. After I put the thanks down on the card, I put some glossy accents just in the center part of that sentiment, just to kind of echo the glossiness of the butterfly in the background with the embossing. Once I've got that glossy accents on there, I will put it aside to dry completely. I have my glossy accents in a bottle that has a really, really fine metal tip. So that's perfect for adding a little bit of it to a fine sentiment die like this. You can also do it in the bottle that it comes in, but this metal tip makes it a little bit finer and just a little bit easier to control when you've got a really fine line. Once I've got as much glossy accents on there as I want, I take my bottle and I tap it on my desk a few times right side up just to get as much of that glossy accents out of that metal tip. And then I squeeze it, kind of like burping it. So if any remaining glossy accents happens to be in that little fine metal bit, it pushes out, and that way I'm not going to get a clog next time I go to use my bottle. Next, I am doing my happy birthday sentiment. So I'm gluing it onto the front of the card, and once I've got that glued down and dried, I'm going to take some stickles and put it on the center part of my happy birthday sentiment, exactly the same way as I've done the glossy accents. And then after I put it on my happy birthday, I'm also going to add a little bit just around the outside of the butterfly wings and the body, just to kind of tie in the glitter, the sparkle, and have a little bit on more than just the sentiment of the card. The glossy accents and the stickles aren't 100% necessary. You could do the cards without them, but I just find sometimes just a bit of an extra texture just adds a bit to the card. Now when I put my stickles down, I squeezed the bottle just a little bit and it got a little bit of a bubble in there, so it splattered around a little bit. The easiest way to fix this is to take something fine and pointy. So I'm using my die pick here, and I'm just kind of lifting it off of the background of the cardstock. You may see a slight little bit of glossiness just from the glue base of the stickles, but it will take the majority off of it, and it makes it look a little bit more neat and tidy. You could also use an embossing folder to get a very similar look to this, using ink on the part of the embossing folder that would push an image out and therefore making like a letterpress background. I chose to do this with dies because I just really liked the idea of using my die in a different way. That die cut that we used to do the letterpress area can be reused over and over again. Just make sure to clean the die off of it, or the ink off of it, so that it's clean for the next use. And there are our completed cards with a fun letterpress die cut impression on our card base. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I appreciate the time you spent with me.